Of human rights work in Australia. He acted, of course, in the Tampa case and is also well known for his work in the Patrick dispute on the Melbourne docks. Julian has also... Julian has written a children's book. He's written a book on the English language called Word Watching. And his latest book is Watching Brief, Reflections on Rights, Law and Justice. Thank you, Julian. Philip Gourevitch is on my near left. He's the editor of the Paris Review and is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He wrote one of the best-known books about the Rwandan genocide entitled We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed Along with Our Families. It won several awards. His latest book, which we'll be discussing today, is entitled Standard Operating Procedure. It's about the photos taken at Abu Ghraib in 2003, but it's about a lot more besides, and we hope to take up some of these issues this morning. I'm going to ask Philip to begin by speaking for 3 or 4 minutes about the book, and then we'll open it up to a discussion or conversation between the three of us before giving you a chance in the last 10 minutes to ask questions of all three of us. Thanks, Philip.
Okay. Thank you. The book that I've written is very much about these American soldiers who were served at Abu Ghraib, the lowest of the low American soldiers. A great deal has been written about the policy in Washington of the Bush administration that sanctioned torture and abuse and suspended the Geneva Conventions. And I address that in the book as well, particularly the way that that was brought to bear at Abu Ghraib. But these soldiers who you see in the photographs, the soldiers who were implementing these policies, didn't even know about those policies. They were completely unaware of any of the memoranda that have since come to light, of the policy discussions amongst administration lawyers. They wouldn't have understood them, particularly because they had no training or background in being prison guards of the benign or the malign kind. They were trained as combat military police. And the book is really heavily based on their accounts of their own experience in interviews done with the filmmaker Errol Morris and with me. And these interviews are what you really hear is the voices of those soldiers. But I thought, since I hope we'll address some of that as we go along, that I would just read a very short passage from the book that addresses this big question about the American traditions. There is a constant temptation, this comes about halfway through the book when it's been a little bit rough going, there is a constant temptation when rendering an account of history to distort reality by making too much sense of it. This temptation is greatest when the history is fresh and deals with crises that are ongoing, crises that mold our understanding of our world and ourselves. Surely, if you've come this far in this sordid tale, you must crave some relief, some release from the relentless claustrophobic annihilation of the dungeon, a clear and cleansing note of sanity, an interlude of avenging justice, or an eruption of decency, the entry of a hero. But surely you don't want to be deceived. There is no such solace or sanctuary in this story. Abu Ghraib was bedlam, and the military intelligence block was its sick racing heart. There was no excuse for it, and there was nothing to show for it either, no great score of useful intelligence, no ends to justify the means. Nobody has ever even bothered to pretend otherwise. The horror of Tier 1A was entirely gratuitous, and it just kept getting worse. You probably know this by now, too, Sergeant Ken Davis said. Once you dig your hands into Abu Ghraib, you don't come out the same. There's a part of you that either died or that is totally confused. So what's the point? What's the use? Why vex your soul? What's the choice? There is no keeping our hands clean of Abu Ghraib. Ignoring it doesn't work, nor does denouncing it, and there's no disavowing it, never mind denying it. The stain is inescapable and irreversible, and it is ours, and if we have any hope of containing it and living it down, it can only come from seeing it whole. The stain is ours because whatever else the Iraq War was about, it was always, above all, about America and the projection of America's force and America's image into the world. Iraq was the stage, and Iraqis would suffer for that, enduring some 50 deaths for every American life lost. In this, and by every other measure of devastation, it was very much their war. But although there were Iraqis who supported the war, seeing hope and opportunity for their country or themselves, the war was not their choice. It was an American war because America's elected officials decided to wage it of their own initiative, at a time of our choosing, as the President said. And it was a war about America because it was fought in the name of our freedom and the world's. What was at stake for the war's advocates, skeptics, and opponents alike was an American story, the story of America as a champion of law and liberty at home and abroad, a tough but righteous arbiter of the destiny of nations, intolerant only of intolerance, a scourge to rogue regimes and bandit dictators who usurp the innate craving of all humankind to aspire to her example. In their most soaring pitches, the authors of the war described its objective as nothing less than the extension of the American Revolution to Saddam's tyrannized subjects, and then by sheer power of influence or by expansion of the campaign to the rest of the Muslim world. Because of such claims, the war was often cast by its more sympathetic chroniclers as a war of ideas, liberty, democracy, and human rights versus fascism, tribalism, and tyranny. And because democratic self-rule has never been imposed upon a people by the military invasion of a foreign power, many of the war's critics regarded the adventure as romantic and reactionary, an imperial folly. Either way, the president and his heralds were understood to be charged by bold ambition, and as Abraham Lincoln said of America's founding fathers, if they succeeded, they were to be immortalized. Their names were to be transferred to counties and cities and rivers and mountains and to be revered and sung and toasted through all time. If they failed, they were to be called knaves and fools and fanatics for a fleeting hour, then to sink and be forgotten. Only by now, the Founding Fathers' ambition had succeeded too well for an American failure on the scale and scope of the Iraq War to be so readily consigned to oblivion. I'll leave it there.
Thanks. You said something about distorting reality at the beginning of that passage. And I wanted to begin by talking about the famous photographs themselves, Leash Girl and the Human Pyramid and the Crucifixion. So that one popular account of these photographs is that they revealed some essential truth about the Iraq War or about Abu Ghraib. Having read your book, I have to say that they didn't reveal that truth. There were a whole number of different truths that seemed to be disclosed by your book. I wondered if you could tell us something about the way that these photos developed over time. For example, the difference between the Leash Girl photograph and the Human Pyramid photograph.
The photographs that were taken at the prison by soldiers are, well, they're unique and a novelty in a great many ways. I don't think there's ever been a situation in history where the iconic images of a historical event were created by the participants in that event so directly and so concretely. And that makes a big difference in the way that we ended up receiving them. Had these pictures been taken by photojournalists, which of course would have been impossible because they never would have been able to get there, journalists would have been heralded and sung and their names transferred to rivers and streams, as Abe Lincoln would have it. That would have been a huge scoop, and it would have been seen in a different light. It would have been seen that somebody was exposing something these people were doing, but they were exposing themselves. And this is the first war in which an important technological innovation is amongst us, which is the cheap portable digital camera. Every soldier pretty much had one. Soldiers who took these pictures had a lot of different motives and a lot of different reasons, and they shifted, as you say, throughout time. The most probably photo-happy of these soldiers in this group was Corporal Charles Grainer, who was the MP in charge of the night shift on the military intelligence block, the MI block at Abu Ghraib, where these photos were taken, and a young woman named Sabrina Harmon, who had been aspiring in civilian life to be a cop and specifically to become a forensic photographer, a crime scene photographer. She did become a crime scene photographer at Abu Ghraib, and she went to jail for that. She took what seemed to be the first photographs of this group on the first nights that they were given charge of the prison. And basically her photographs on those first nights, and some of Charles Grainer's from the same night, have a very different quality from the iconic photographs. They basically show prisoners with no soldiers in the frame as they are discovered by somebody coming down, say, a prison hallway, looking through the bars of a prison cell, or in a hallway, prisoners bound, shackled, panties on their heads, hands behind their back, solitary figures, and they're very photojournalistic. They're very much somebody discovering something and putting the camera between them and the thing they're seeing to register it. And she wrote letters home. Sabrina Harmon, one of the really remarkable sets of documents that is in this book are these letters she wrote home to her wife in the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, saying essentially, here's what I'm seeing. I'm taking photographs because I want proof, because nobody would believe what we're seeing. If I just told you what I just saw, nobody would believe it. This is what's allowed. And she kept talking about wanting to take pictures of what was allowed. And she ricochets between, in her photographs and her accounts, a certain sense of excitement and pleasure and kind of sensationalism, titillation at seeing things that are so shocking, and a sense of real outrage and of kind of moral confusion about what to do about it. Charles Grainer, he took a lot of photographs before, but he mostly took them of his girlfriend, and he was very into kind of swapping them around. He liked to take sex pictures of her. She didn't particularly like that, but she allowed it from time to time. He liked to take a lot of what they called happy snaps, pictures of soldiers posing in front of things with their thumbs up, posing with funny-looking fruit, posing with, next to blown-up tanks and defaced Sodom memorials, dropping their pants and mooning each other, prank photographs, kid photographs. He was older, but that's what he liked. At Abu Ghraib, he started taking photographs too, and he quickly started including the soldiers in the pictures. And you start to see some of the mugging and the posing. And with time, this evolved into a kind of staging of photographs. Sabrina followed him in this. Leash Girl, the photograph of his girlfriend, Lindy England, holding the leash with the naked Iraqi prisoner on the end of the leash, was a photograph taken by him after extricating that prisoner from a cell. She was not dragging him around. The whole session lasted just a few seconds. One of the interesting things about digital photography is you have a timestamp. So you can actually put these things together with external documents, see what happened. And she was not posing. He sort of handed her the strap, went click, 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 took the strap back. Whether he intended these pictures to look like a little girl dominating this naked Iraqi man and dragging him around in this S&M pose on a leash, or whether he saw as soon as he'd taken them that that's what he had and started to show them off to other people, he was very big on showing these photographs off. Why? Was he asking permission? Was he flaunting his bad boy quality? All of the above. But there's no question that he never kept it a secret. He wanted others to be in some way complicit, to give tacit or explicit approval of what was going on that block, which they were being instructed to do, but also given a kind of license to abuse prisoners that wasn't always perfectly defined. By the night of the Human Pyramid was Lindy England's 21st birthday. And to some extent, it seems that Grainer was showing off for her that night. He built this pyramid and started the abuse of these naked prisoners that night, in large part as a kind of stage set. On the other hand, a lot of this stuff was happening anyway, and so trying to distinguish exactly how much of it was staged and how much of it was not staged. These were prisoners who had been brought to that cell block that night after a riot in one of the other prison sections, an outdoor camp, where there were a lot of riots, and these soldiers were, this is not an excuse, this is an explanation, were under constant mortar attack. Soldiers had been killed at the prison, prisoners were killed at the prison by insurgent mortar fire. It was an extremely tense place, and the message always was, these prisoners are the guys who would be trying to kill you if they were on the other side of the wall. So this is one of the most crucial violations of the Geneva Convention that, of course, the photographs don't show at all, which is that Abu Ghraib should never have been allowed to exist in a combat zone. It was in the heart of the Sunni Triangle, in the midst of the insurgency, which is totally illegal under any laws of war. And one of the reasons is that you're not supposed to be, you're supposed to be protecting your prisoners, means you're also not supposed to be viewing them as the person who's trying to kill you and your buddies like that minute. So there's a lot of aggression between them. These guys had been brought in as people who'd been attacking American soldiers, and they were told to sort of give them the business. And what happened was this human pyramid, which became, of course, filled with posing and posturing. And so the meaning of these photographs, what they, in a sense, describe, became separated from the reality as they became dispersed into the world without any explanation from the people who took the pictures. The people who took the pictures, whose accounts of the thing are the core of this project, were not allowed to speak. They were under arrest, pending charges. They had lawyers who would tell them not to say a word. They were muzzled, essentially. The army had taken them out of circulation before the photos could be leaked. And we were allowed, essentially, to look at the photographs as a kind of kinky expression of their own rogue behavior, which is entirely untrue.
And yet, they do reveal a larger truth. The ordinariness of the photographs tells you something about what was ordinary in Abu Ghraib. It's interesting. I mean, it's terrible that no one above the rank of sergeant has done any jail time on account of anything that was revealed in any of the photographs. And although some of the characters do express their reservations after the event and sometimes during the events of what was going on, they all do seem to have understood that this was just okay. I mean, the title of the book says it all.
That it was okay and it was wrong. They knew it was wrong, but they thought it was okay.
But they understood it was okay.
In this context, I mean, a lot of what you do in war is obviously wrong. You know, you run into a place and you stomp down doors and do all these things, and it feels wrong. You scatter children, you shoot people that you're not quite sure who they are and ask about it later. But it's sanctioned. It's what you're supposed to do. And that tension was there.
But they
were not.
They're people who are in combat, whereas these are people who've been taken out of combat and put in jail, including 10-year-old children. And it looks as though they were being told by implication, what you're doing is okay. There will not be recriminations. And it's interesting to see their response when an investigation begins and photographs are suddenly contraband. I think they felt betrayed.
They did feel betrayed.
Yeah.
They were betrayed. I mean, the fact is that Charles Grainer, we talk about the uses of the photos, Charles Grainer in particular, when I say he liked to show the photographs, he would show the photographs to higher up. The photograph of the leash girl, the photograph of Lindy England holding the strap, at the end of which is a prisoner, he showed to medics at the prison. He showed to the medical court, the prison, and said, listen, we had a situation where there was a prisoner in this cell. He'd been put there by other people during the day shift. They said he was hostile, violent, hurling insults and spitting at them. He was put in there naked. It's a windowless isolation cell with no facilities. He'd soiled himself. When I opened the door, he made a threatening gesture. I thought, how am I supposed to extricate him? I have no means to do so. I found this strap. I made a loop. I threw it over his shoulders. I brought him out like this. Is it okay to do this? He was getting permission. He was a clever guy. So if he was doing this with a certain amount of pleasure, and there's evidence that at times he had sadistic pleasure, the Army is supposed to be able to accommodate and discipline sadism. Sadism is not, an excuse for a breakdown in policy. And the point is, he was doing this and showing it to his higher-ups, and they were like, that's okay. He gave them the photographs. He showed these photographs repeatedly to higher-ups. So when they felt betrayed, they were betrayed. They were suddenly framed by the frame of their own photographs. The investigation, from the moment it began, looked never beyond the frame of the photograph. Anything that was outside that frame, the policy that created the circumstances depicted, was inadmissible.
Because one of the charges against Sabrina Harmon later on arose out of the death of one of the captives, the famous photograph of the corpse packed in ice and gauze over his eyes. And one of the charges initially brought, but I think dropped, was a charge of interfering with evidence. Because she had lifted the gauze off one of the eyes of the corpse and photographed him and then put the gauze back. That was said to be interfering with evidence in the death of the prisoner, whereas the people who had killed him and who had hosed him down, washed him, patched up the wounds that they'd previously caused, packed him in ice, that wasn't interfering with the evidence.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Astounding.
I mean, her theory, and who knows if it's true, is that they essentially threw out that charge because they didn't want to deal with bringing those photographs and the whole story into court at all, which seems perfectly reasonable. There's considerable evidence that at the time that the investigation, the Army's own investigation began, that essentially what happened was the Army was confronted with a PR problem, and everybody understood that. People say, ooh, there was a conspiracy to cover this thing up. And I actually don't think that when you have a hierarchical bureaucracy, you actually need a conspiracy. It is designed to cover itself up. Everybody knows that you don't want to be the guy that made trouble. You don't want the guy who is under your command to make trouble, so you don't report the trouble he makes to the guy above you, because then you've become a problem to the guy above you. And there's something called command responsibility, which in its ideal form sounds really ideal, which is that every officer is responsible for all soldiers under his command. And if their shoes aren't shined, his commanding officer can say, what's wrong with your guys? They're all scruffy. So if they do something wrong, he's done something wrong, which gives him an incentive to run a tight, disciplined ship. What happens when there's a real breakdown is, on the other hand, if he reports a problem to his superior, he's become a problem for his superior. He hasn't solved the problem for his superior. And so a kind of mafia-style omerta automatically kicks in, We no longer have a draft in the United States. We don't have compulsory military service. We have volunteer army, which means a professional standing army, which means people are sitting there in the middle of Abu Ghraib or something making a calculation that if they get through the next 2 weeks and get their discharge, they'll move from a P4 to a P5 and their pension will be better, that if they get 3 more weeks in combat service, an extension, that'll probably up their overall tally this way and that. This is important. People are actually thinking about their employment status and all of these sorts of things. So there's an enormous pressure to cover something like this up. And the Army's looking at these pictures and they're thinking, if we don't do anything about this and they get out, we'll look bad for not doing anything about this. If, on the other hand, we book a bunch of people and bring them to trial, the pictures are going to get out. Because if we have a trial, we're going to have to introduce the pictures, and so if we don't want the pictures to get out, what do? So they had a concerted effort. They actually sent agents of the Criminal Investigative Division of the Army around the country to the homes of friends and family members of these soldiers to figure out if they could recover from their hard drives the digital photographs that might have been emailed from Abu Ghraib, and to see if, part of the problem with digital photography, or part of the wonderful thing about digital photography, I would rather say, is that you just can't stop it. You can't just destroy the film. If it's been emailed, it just proliferates like a virus. And they were trying to recover all this stuff. Meanwhile, they held these people pending charges at Camp Liberty in Baghdad. And so if the photographs did get out, they could always say, we're on top of it. We've got these guys. We've completed 2 investigations. We're just about to level charges. But I really wonder, as the Army tried to weigh the damage, it seems to me that had the photographs not been leaked to the press, they never would have prosecuted the matter.
In the Vietnam War, of course, we were familiar with all these moving images that seemed to somehow define the war and indeed mobilized a lot of the opposition to the war. The U.S. Army stopped all that in the first Iraq War and the second Iraq War. They embedded journalists. Very little footage seemed to come out of the war, and the footage couldn't be used to mobilize opposition. Do you think there'll be a response